This research was made possible by a generous grant from the UNLV Foundation and allocations by the Nevada Board of Regents. It was with their support and personal encouragement that I was able to emerge with a new way of evaluating legislation and candidates seeking public office. The three policy areas of prevailing wage, minimum wage, and retail cannabis provide excellent vantage points into applying this new approach. Nevada is perfect for conducting a study of this nature because of the state's diverse construction markets, which heavily influence prevailing wage decisions, the state's history as being the first state to implement minimum wage protections on a bifurcated system that is at times linked to a 24-hour overtime cycle, and also Nevada being the first state to offer its citizens the ability to submit an initiative petition with the intention of proposing new legislation and amending the state constitution. These three policy areas are also splendid to work with because they have very clearly defined stakeholders. In the case of prevailing wage, the labor unions and construction workers are one half of the equation, and the bidding contractors and those paying for the construction are on the other side of things. Stakeholders in minimum wage policy are the lowest earners in the state and those employing them. And a new policy area of retail cannabis has, simplistically putting it, the two stakeholders of the proprietors of these new businesses and the state at large. Prevailing wage is a great starting point because it all started with Nevada, when Nevada's first senior senator, William Stewart, was on the floor of the U.S. Senate arguing in favor of an 8-hour workday. It was in these remarks that the quintessential argument in favor of prevailing wage was first introduced on the record. And that sentiment is that such labor protections perpetuate happiness and prolong workers' productivity. This sentiment is espoused by supporters of prevailing wage and other labor protections to this very day, where prevailing wage is a perennial legislative topic. A contemporary example of this being the case occurred in 2000, when two of the biggest newspapers in Las Vegas took on opposing sides of this issue in editorial publications. The Las Vegas Review-Journal made it a rural versus urban matter, contrasting the construction markets in various parts of the state. In these publications, the Review-Journal also espoused the incredible hypothesis at the time that the construction industry might slow down in Las Vegas and that legislatively and in statute, the wages wouldn't match the real-world climate. As a matter of contrast, the Las Vegas Sun, in favor of prevailing wage, made it purely a matter of the defined stakeholders, which they characterized as underpaid workers and cutthroat bidders. When it comes to prevailing wage, it is a heated topic because there are two rather partisan calculations to define just what prevailing wage entails. The very first calculation was implemented by Labor Secretary Frances Perkins when the first clarifications to the Davis-Bacon Act were introduced. Frances Perkins espoused a calculation that if there's not a majority of workers in a particular trade earning at a precise level, 30% would suffice for defining the minimum and prevailing wage that could be paid for governmental projects. Some decades later, the Reagan administration clarified the Davis-Bacon Act again as a clear-cut majority, and if the majority is not met by a means of 50% plus 1, it would go to the average calculation. And so in this particular example of various welders, let's say, earning certain wages, we're able to compare and contrast these two calculations. In this instance, 31% of workers are holding and demanding a certain wage level, which meets Frances Perkins's calculation. However, it doesn't meet President Reagan's calculation. And so, implementing this equation I'm very excited to have arrived upon, we can find that depending on which candidate is in office and which policy is enacted, there will be particular changes to earning potential. In the Francis Perkins calculation, some of the population will remain even at their current earning level, whereas their lower earning co-workers and peers in the trade generally see increases ranging from $12 up to more than twice what they're earning now, compared to President Reagan's calculation, in which a majority of the labor force sees a decrease in pay. However, the remainder see incremental increases. And facially, this is a rather explicit comparison. However, as Elko County's chief financial officer, Cash Miner, testified during the 1999 legislative session, the rural markets, such as Elko, have a going rate at the $15 level, and that adjusting these wages in statute as a prevailing wage of more than that to a too great a degree causes these jobs to not be enacted because the county can't afford the higher prevailing rate, even though there are workers ready to work at the local level. And so this is incredibly reminiscent of Speaker O'Neill's sentiment that all politics are local. And so with that in mind, as we look back at this table, what looks like a 100% increase in pay and earning potential could in fact be a 100% decrease if the job is never hired, if the construction never happens. And so that's why it's very important that once you derive these figures, you must compare them to the geography and the markets and the precincts you're attempting to solicit votes from. When it comes to votes, the biggest question is how many real votes are actually hanging in the balance. And to clarify that, minimum wage is a very astute place to start because the state actually does compile rather precise data on how many workers are earning at each level, which is an excellent start. And in this past legislative session, there was a vehicle to make changes to the minimum wage. It initially started as an overtime bill, however, it was amended to include an increase in the minimum wage. And this amendment came to be when Senator Farley suggested
the minimum wage as a potential compromise.
Upon hearing that, Senator Menendo then asked,
"What the hell is the number?"
So Senator Farley clarified,
I would like to get it up to $9 an hour.
Okay.
We would then return to the defined stakeholders. It would incentivize and provide a pay increase in the earning potential for over 5% of the electorate, over 60,000 voters, which I initially thought might have been a bit minute. However, as I reviewed the state's electoral history for statewide political races, I found that the highest ranking political figure in state history, Senator Harry Reid, was last challenged for re-election in 2010. And it was in that campaign he succeeded with 50.3% of the votes. And should this population have shifted or come out for his competitor, then the national landscape of partisan politics would have been redefined in an instant, and Senator Reid would have not been reelected, but instead he ceremoniously announced his retirement on YouTube in the middle of the legislative session. And so, with this in mind, and with the amendment passing the floor of the Senate, Senator Farley, joined by Senator Settlemyre and his fantastic tie, and I with my fantastic tie, we happened to wear the same tie that particular day, we testified to the Assembly Committee on Commerce and Labor. And in addition to many other fascinating pieces of information, the committee was given 3 reasons for a $9 an hour minimum wage. And first of all, going back to the aforementioned figures, it would bring a pay increase to a substantial portion of the state. And also, this being 2016, the Affordable Care Act will come into effect. And by adjusting to wages at this point in time in this way, there would be a drastic decrease in the overhead costs when it comes to these federally mandated premiums. And thirdly, it was brought to the committee's attention that there are 10 national companies with hundreds of locations in the state that are already paying their starting employees at this level. And so, on the last day of session, this bill came to a culminating vote on the assembly floor. And we'll pay attention to the fact that it's 10:21 p.m. This is the evening of sine die, which means the legislative session will end at midnight. And the legislative branch of the state of Nevada will, for all intents and purposes, cease to exist until February of 2017. And so, as Assemblyman Stewart logs his vote from District 22, the votes are cast. There are 21 for and 19 against. And when it reached the Speaker's desk, this is what he said.
The motion failed.
Adoption of a conference committee report is considered final passage and requires a majority of the entire body, so 22 votes.
22 votes. There are 21 votes here, which means if one of these red or white names were green, a portion of our neighbors working quite hard at a low wage would see an increase in their earning potential should they retain their current line of work. That is for them to take with them as they approach the 2016 election. But in 2016, more than 40 votes will be cast, as is the case in the state assembly. More than 75 cents an hour will be in the balance, and more than 100,000 citizens will be asked to participate in deciding the state's earning potential, which is what's truly in question. And it is the ballot question in particular that, simply put, should read, should willing benefactors give the state treasurer over $4 million to pay for law enforcement and education? That is the precise topic that's at issue with Initiative Petition 1. This $4 million figure is derived from regulatory fees alone, which are laid out as follows. And it is simply a quarter of the regulatory fees that get us to that point. So, as the state of Illinois took some time to reach the $1 million mark in revenue from this particular sector, Nevada's starting line is $4 million. Right away from dispensaries alone, not including testing facilities or cultivation or the other mandatory parts of infrastructure. And with an annual baseline of over $500,000 in regulatory fees and license renewals, this is a clear stimulus that the voters will be able to decide on. So, with these 3 policy areas, I've devised what I like to call a 3-party system. These figures represent how much one voter in each of these 3 cohorts can spend on campaign contributions and lobbying fees to at least break even or make a profit on the most advantageous legislation that concerns their particular demographic. And this really reminded me of some of the work I did many years ago, quantifying the net present value of some prime mortgages. Now it's the net present value of votes. And it was all a matter of trade volumes. And the concept of volume was incredibly reminiscent of work I enjoyed doing in a recording studio. And so I thought, why not put these values into a recording interface and see what kind of volume they generate? And this is sort of why the Professor Page over in Princeton is asserting that America is an oligarchy. Because, as is the case in recording studios, if one portion is louder than the rest, it's hard to detect the other elements, whether it's vocals and percussions or rhythm and bass guitars conflicting. There needs to be an equalizer, which there is. There is an incredibly poetic equalizer in the number of votes on election day that these three people have. Each one has just one. And so this brings in a brand new era of checks and balances. There are over 100,000 voters earning the minimum wage. However, there's only one member of conglomerated cannabis that can spend at this level. Now, when I began this study, I thought politics was a cut and dry arena where the loudest voice wins. However, with this new approach and mindset, I hear America singing, and the varied carols I hear exemplify what's actually at issue when it comes to democracy in this country, and is a stern reminder of what everyone's in fact fighting for. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.